First of all, I want to say how glad I am, Tara, that you're doing this project. It's just so rewarding, not to me personally so much, but to the profession, that that the background of what our predecessors have done and the background of what we're doing now and will do in the future is being recorded. I think that what people are learning from your work are things that they just had no idea about. People have a view of social work. I was talking to my daughter last night about, she sees social workers as people who work in welfare offices, and that was the term used, in welfare offices helping those poor unfortunates. There's more to social work than that, and I've experienced some of it myself and certainly heard about it through the interviews that were done so many years ago. By way of background, I was born in a Marine camp in the United States at the end of the Second World War. My father was a U.S. Marine, and we moved shortly after, my mother and father and I moved shortly after to a small town in Washington State called Bremerton, another military town. And I lived there until I was about 16. Without going into any detail, my childhood was extremely turbulent, extremely tumultuous, extremely chaotic. I was provided with examples of how not to deal with mental health and addiction, and continued to make choices out of that background for the next 25 years of my life. Finished high school and began, well, actually I began working when I was 12 as a clerk, and worked as a clerk and a secretary until I was about 24, 25 years of age, doing all kinds of interesting clerical stuff, and being authentic about that. One of my most interesting ones was working in a private detective agency, and I won't say that that stood me well in my future career as a social worker, but it certainly exposed me to a different view of life. I married, had a child, and became a single parent when I was, I don't know, 26, I guess, something like that. And at the time, I was working as a secretary in a mental health clinic. The U.S. federal government had funded mental health clinics across the United States, and I was working in one as, excuse me, as I said, as a social worker. Pardon me, not a social worker, a secretary. I get my professions confused here.
You're not like a social worker.
Well, actually I was, and I didn't know it. I had the opportunity to do some volunteer work at that clinic, and I was doing intake work with clients. And that involved, as I understood it then, getting background information, name and address, and what the client saw as the issue, and what they thought might happen next. I did one interview that I remember in particular with a middle-aged man who had 4 children, and he had been accused, and I think not convicted, but accused of shoplifting. He had stolen some hamburger. And when I interviewed him, that seemed to me to be very important. I presented this at the case conference with the psychiatrist and the professional social workers, and I was taken aback, startled very much when what I thought was the important reason for the man's issue, he had kids to feed, he had no money, and they were hungry, that instead the focus was on his psychiatric diagnosis. According to the professionals in the case conference, he clearly had a case of psychosocial who's-its-what's-its, and it was that which should be dealt with. That didn't sit well with me, because while it may very well have been true that he experienced that diagnosis, what was also true is that he and his family were hungry. And it occurred to me that maybe something could be done about that. My childhood had been spent in an environment where one did not question anything. one accepted the situation and dealt with it as best one could. That was augmented, I would say, by living in a military town where in the 1950s it was clearly my country right or wrong, and one did not question what policies existed at the time. So that interview with the client really set the stage for what I thought I might do with my life. In those days, the 50s in the United States, women had, at least as far as I knew, two choices. They became a wife or a secretary or a nurse. And it became clear to me that I wasn't cut out for any of those. And I got a lot of encouragement to try for university. Because of my experience in the mental health clinic, I decided that social work was what I would go for. It seemed to me to be a practical kind of work. I didn't know about professions in those days, but it seemed to me to be some background that would lead to more for me. And I didn't mean in terms of money, I meant more in terms of being important in the world, doing something that mattered. During the time I was in university, I was a single parent for the next, well, I'm still a single parent. I have a 50-year-old child and I'm still a single parent. Being a mother really is an ongoing opportunity. I worked at secretarial work. I've always been a bit of an overachiever, and at the University of Washington, I did a 4-year bachelor's degree in 2 years. And at the University of Michigan, I did a 2-year master's degree in less than a year and a half. While working part-time, also scholarships and grants allowed me to get through the university without indebtedness. Can we stop for a minute?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
I need to take a breath.
Sure.
That's what you can leave the other one on. I just kind of think about where I'm going to go next. Am I being too personal?
No, not at all. No.
Okay.
Could we maybe just talk a little bit about what you studied in your undergrad at Washington State? Because you just said you did a 4-year and 2 years. Like, did you do psych or was it a social work degree? Like, could we just?
Oh, okay, sure.
And then maybe, like, was there anything that happened? Like, was there anything happening politically or socially or anything like that while you were doing your undergrad?
Yeah, maybe what I'll do is I'll stop and do the kind of the social milieu.
That'd be great. Can I top you up?
Thanks very much.
You're very welcome.
These chocolate things are very good.
They are.
Very tasty, yeah. Thank you for thinking of it.
Oh, well, I thought it would be good to have some snacks. I used to do a lot of community development work, so, having coffee matters. I'm just gonna fix this one little corner of this curtain a little bit. Got any coffee?
So could you give me kind of a lead in?
Sure. So Karen, we were just talking about your education, and I was wondering if you tell me a little bit about the work that you did or the degree that you took at the University of Washington. And I'm also kind of wondering about kind of the social, political, economic reality that was happening in that particular time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, The School of Social Work at the University of Washington, and that whole period of time was a real time of blossoming for me into a broader world. Being on a university campus with 35,000 students in the, what was it? I guess it was in the late 60s, was a real eye-opener for a little girl from the wrong side of the tracks. The courses that I took, I was quite certain that I wasn't cut out to do one-to-one social work. So the courses that I took were courses that were around community organizing, were around social policy, political science. I remember my first psychology, my introductory psychology class with 500 students in the same classroom. And I thought, oh my, I've got my work cut out for me here to succeed. The classes were informative, and certainly I learned a lot of factual knowledge. What I also, I'm not sure that I learned this, but it gave a validity to my personality, which is one of questioning. How come? Why not? What if? And those kinds of questions always opened more doors for me, at least as far as education goes. At the time, I have to get my university straight here. At the time, the Vietnam War was allegedly winding down. It had been going on for decades, although the American involvement had not been for that long a time. And I was exposed at the university to people who had been in the war, people who I now know were experiencing PTSD, who found it so difficult to function in a social setting. And that too was an eye-opener. When I was a kid, I was around a lot of American military people, and the way people functioned then is if they experienced what we now call PTSD is they drank and never talked at all about what had gone on in the Second World War. So the university experience was a real blessing to me because it gave legitimacy to the kind of person that I was. It was okay to ask questions. It was okay to not understand. It was okay to try to figure things out. It was okay to think about things differently. It also, I also became part of a social movement, the anti-war movement, and one of my most memorable moments is marching down the I-5 freeway through downtown Seattle with 100,000 other people, expressing our concern for what was happening in the United States and Vietnam then. Again, the legitimacy of being part of something that was clearly bigger than myself, that things were not quite right in the world. At the same time, previous to that, I'd had some experience with the women's movement. Excuse me, which was going on in at least in the United States. And again, a questioning of, is it enough to be a housewife? And that was the term that was used then. Is it enough to be the little woman? Is it enough to try to be a good mother? Is there a role for women outside the home, outside the traditional workplaces? Is there a role for, is it valid, is it okay for women to seek their own fulfillment? And a silly example, but one that I remember vividly, is macrame. I would go out of the house, I was married at the time, I would go out of the house leaving my child with my husband and go out and sit with a bunch of women and we'd do this hand weaving stuff and we'd talk. We'd talk about husbands and kids and maybe a little bit about politics, although not very much because that wasn't part of our world at that time. But it was the first place where identity as a woman, different from the traditional role models that I had experienced, came out. the women's movement, the peace movement became integrated into who I am. I think I've always had sorry, I can't think of the word. I've had a demand for the inclusion of others in all of the life of a society, whether it's the life of a family, the life of a church, for example, the life of community organizations. And so I integrated those two movements as part of my way of being for the future. I moved to Ann Arbor, to the University of Michigan after I finished. Sorry, I have to think about my field placement. Excuse me.
Yeah,
I need to go back for a minute.
Sure, absolutely.
My field placement at the University of Washington was, I forget what the organization was, but I got approval to take on organizing the transition, some would say takeover, the transition of a faculty child care center to become a student, a child care center for the children of students, of whom I was one. The child care center was located in our student housing project, and yet our kids couldn't go there. So I got advice and consultation from faculty at the School of Social Work as to how to go about, as a community development process, the taking over of that and the transition of that child care center to become one for the students. I also was president of the community association and was able to get substantial improvements to the housing, which had been built as temporary housing for World War II vets 25 years before. That was the first experience I'd ever had at organizing, planning, developing a community toward a broader goal. Again, I took some of the learnings from that with me. I moved then to Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan and was in a dual stream of social policy and social planning. That was, again, another real mind-opening experience for me, because there were people there who had accomplishments that I knew of. One of my graduate seminars was with Wilbur Cohen, who had been the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. And Wilbur had been a staff person in the Social Security Administration in the 1930s, when they developed the first title of the Social Security Act. I think the Social Security Act now has maybe 30 titles, and each one deals with a different program. The first title of the Social Security Act, which he helped draft, was built with the idea that there would be a national health insurance program in the United States. That was his dream in the 1930s. And as we know, we still don't have a national health insurance program in the United States that's publicly funded and universally available. And there were others in the faculty who had that kind of accomplishment and that kind of vision. Again, encouraging me to think that the world could be a better place. Individuals could make a difference in having that happen. Where social work was so important to me at that time, and continues to be, I think, is that social work provided an intellectual framework within which social change could happen. It was, you weren't just some radical. There was a view that the world could change, and here were some ways: policy, individual practice, social planning. Here are some methodologies, I call them, which could lead to that social improvement. And I came to realize at the same time, around the same time, that public policy provides a framework within which society operates, and that using social work methods, maybe the social policy, the the public policy framework could be expanded. So my education at the two universities was a lot about legitimizing questioning, emphasizing the importance and the possibility of social change, and providing intellectual frameworks within which I could make sense of what I wanted to do and of how my my professional life was going. My field placements at the University of Michigan, I did two. One was at, what was it called? It was called, there was a provincial-wide child care advocacy association. And I did my field placement with the woman who was the head of that statewide institution. Excuse me, I get my countries mixed up there. Of that statewide institution. And we did lobbying, and we wrote letters, and we organized meetings, and we met with state legislators. And I was learning exactly how you go about making a public impact. And to me, it's always had, I would say, three elements. One is the community organizing, which takes place largely at the local level, although that can be the state level too, if you're bringing together, say, a number of associations of child care organizations. It has the second level, which is the black box of social policy development, where people get together, they talk, they think, they write, they talk, they argue, they think, come out with policy positions, and then the advocacy work to take that thinking forward. So I had the opportunity at that field placement to do all of those things. My second field placement was one of those transitional experiences. At that time, in the wider world, Vietnam had almost ended. Certainly it was winding down. The peace movement was not as active, at least where I was at that time. The women's movement continued. The civil rights movement was very active at the time, and I had a number of friends who were going to the southern United States to try and improve the terrible conditions of Afro-Americans at the time. But what was also happening was a tremendous uproar about what was happening in Washington, D.C. with the President of the United States.
Who at that time was?
President Nixon. President Nixon had taken over and had promised to be straightforward and truthful and to make the country a better place. Watergate happened, and what Watergate was a break-in and a robbery by a team organized by President Nixon and his colleagues to get information on democratic policies and plans for an election. President Nixon lied about that, and the way we knew that he lied was because he recorded all of his conversations in the White House. Well, somebody leaked those tapes. My field placement at that time was with a national child care development organization whose executive director was the daughter of the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And Judy Helms, she knew everybody. I'm sure I learned a lot about child care advocacy and lobbying. What I also learned was about the American political system, and perhaps there's some relation to other political systems as well. Every morning was started with Judy on the phone talking with her connections across the hill. There's something happening. There was a break-in. There was somebody broke into a hotel. There's some tapes. There's some tapes, and the tapes are saying that they're proving that Nixon lied. The excitement of that time was just beyond belief. again, a little girl from the wrong side of the tracks, I was privileged to listen into this. We were well connected with the child care advocacy community at the time, and the day that President Nixon resigned, Judy and I and a couple of others were sitting in the office of Senator Walter Mondale on Capitol Hill, drinking champagne to the resignation of President Nixon. It was a mind-boggling experience for me because, again, I saw that individuals, well-connected individuals, but hard-working individuals could make a difference, an important difference in an important world. What else do I want to say about the University of Michigan? It was a dream come true for a social work student to have so many of the experts, the well-known authors, scholars, actors such as Wilbur Cohen, and others to talk to and to learn from was just a real dream of an experience. I may think of other things about the university, but that's all. Tara, would you have other questions about the university?
I think I just, it sounds like there was at that time and probably still is something special about the University of Michigan's program or the environment or the people they attracted. I know as I've been sort of looking at, other oral histories, it seems like there's a lot of people who graduated from that program who've gone on to do other things and to kind of push the limits of what we understand as social work, or maybe to push political limits or other limits. So, is there anything, it sounds like some of it was about who was there teaching, but was there kind of an atmosphere that encouraged that kind of practice? Like that practice didn't necessarily have to remain static in the place that it was, that it was expected of you to kind of push the limits of what practice meant, whether that was practice in policy or in community or even in clinical contexts.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's one of the things that I really did want to say, that if there were only one thing that I learned from my university experience, and that was both universities, was the legitimacy of asking questions. Again, why, what if, why not? And to back that up, to learn how to back that up with good policy work, with good research, to not just go out and rant or go out and march, which I also did, but to substantiate the policy positions that you wanted to advocate with impeccable research, with background work that was broad, that was multidisciplinary, concise, precise, easily explained, easily understood. There's just one more thing I wanted to say about the University of Michigan is that it would have been apparent, I guess, in what I said, but I did my field placement in Washington, D.C., which is some distance, 800 miles from Ann Arbor and the University of Michigan. And that was possible because of community development work on my part, working with various professors, because I had to get a field supervisor in Washington. And that wasn't easily come by. But with a lot of assistance, one of the professors decided that he would become the field supervisor in Washington, D.C., and he supervised my work there. So it was another example of learning how to get what I hoped for.
Okay. So a little bit of advocacy on your own behalf.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Being a shrinking violet has never been my way. And asking what I want, even to my detriment, has always been the way that I've always done things. I figure the worst they can say is no, so.
So when you graduated, what happened?
Let's see, when I graduated, at that time, there was a lot, there continued to be a lot of social unrest in the United States. And it became more and more clear that I did not want to stay there. At that time, we didn't have public health insurance, publicly funded health insurance in the United States. And my mother, who was ill, had to wait until she got her old age security check before she could go to the doctor. To me, that was just unconscionable, and I didn't want to live in a country where that was the way that things were operating. I considered a number of other countries, a number of universities, Australia, New Zealand, decided that what I and my then partner, wanted to do was to come to Canada. He was able to get a job. He was an airline pilot. He was able to get a job in Canada, which was very nice, but there was no job for me. So again, I talked to my connections at the University of Michigan, and it turned out that there was a job in Canada which I might be suited for. And the Canadian Mental Health Association, the national office at the time, their past president, their founder and past president, Dr. Jack Griffin, was doing a history project, a documentary history of Canadian psychiatry, volume 1, prior to 1763. And after many conversations, they decided that I would be ideal to carry out that work. There were a lot of conversations that happened in coffee shops. In any case, I was hired to do that work. Dr. Griffin assisted in my immigration. It was easier then, I think, than it is now. And my family and I came to Toronto, I don't remember when. And I had always thought that Canada would be a better place, and that was demonstrated to me my first Christmas in Toronto, where we lived then. My partner and I, and my daughter, who was then 6 or 7, we went down to Nathan Phillips Square, and there was this huge Christmas tree that had been constructed, and it was beautiful, and everything was lovely, and everybody was skating and smiling and all that. And the daily newspaper chose my daughter to photograph next to the Christmas tree for their front page. Well, that sold me on Canada if nothing else would, because there was clearly a place for her and for us at that time. The work was fascinating work. I knew, frankly, nothing about Canadian history. Dr. Griffin could tell from our many conversations that I had a strong desire, wish, and ability to learn. And so my first 3 months on that job were studying Canadian history. And that's where the research methods that I had learned at the University of Michigan and the University of Washington fit into my work life. I had the great good fortune to study the Jesuit relations, which were kind of logs of activities that were written by the Jesuits as they came to Canada, including people like Brebeuf and the others. Had the opportunity to study the Hudson Bay Company archives, which again, the Hudson Bay forts across North America were required to send back reports on what was happening in the daily life of the locations that they were at. So I learned a lot about Canada, which I was thrilled. I've always been a history buff, although I didn't know it at the time, and still am. We found what was the earliest record of psychiatry, and I say that with parentheses or with parentheses around it. When we found a ship's log that said, "Alas, poor John Guy, died of thought, having killed his wife. And we thought, Dr. Griffin and Cyril Greenland, who was his colleague, thought that that died of thought was the first instance of psychiatric illness, in mental illness in Canada at the time. That was in Newfoundland. So I continued that work for a while. I can't remember how long. I imagine the money ran out for the grant, which often happens, as Tara and others would know. I became connected with the Ontario Welfare Council, as it was known then. I think it's now the Ontario Social Development Council. The Ontario Welfare Council, and my responsibilities were to support social planning councils across Ontario. At that time, when was it? The late 70s, I'll say, the late 70s. At that time, there were 26, 27 social planning councils across Ontario, some in areas remote as Kirkland Lake, some in cities as big as Toronto, Ottawa, Hamilton, and others. And there was a committee of social planning councils who came together frequently, 3 or 4 times a year, I guess, to discuss social policy issues of interest and to see if there was some way to develop social policy positions and advocacy around those things. Poverty was always at the top of the list. And when I think back to my interview at the mental health clinic, where the fellow stole hamburger to feed his family, I could see a link. I could see a link that the policies that existed, that for whatever reason he experienced poverty, were still the same and had not substantially changed. I have a parentheses here. This comparison of my experience in the mental health clinic in the, I guess it was in the late 60s, and in the Ontario Welfare Council of Poverty, reminds me again of the policy framework within which people operate. And we don't know it, but we do. We may not recognize it, but we do. And I was thinking that for decades, if not centuries, we have operated in a policy framework that has been informed by quote unquote Christian values. And by that I am quite specific in that for many years it was thought that people who were poor, it was because of their fault. They were lazy, they were stupid, they were a different color, either black or Indian, heaven forbid, and that it was their fault that they were unable to survive, prosper, or progress. And in my personal opinion, the social work framework sometimes carries that kind of attitude as well. That I certainly have no issue with the work of one-on-one to help people deal with their situation as it is and to help them become all that they can be. But to blame them, I think, is a real tragedy and works against certainly what I believe the profession. Maybe it doesn't happen anymore. I can.
Sorry.
No. But I think we can realize if we step back and look at the bigger picture that the policies of organizations such as churches, think residential schools, of society regarding the treatment of women, think sexual abuse, the treatment of kids regarding sexual abuse. Those policies they really inform what we do. And we have the opportunity, if we ask questions, to say, I think something can change here. So I want to continue to make the comparison between different frameworks and the underlying values and principles that support those. And that sometimes helping an individual is really good, and I do that myself. It's very important to do. And sometimes questioning the underlying frameworks, the underpinning frameworks, is equally as important. So that was my parentheses.
Very
Now I forgot where I was. On Ontario Welfare Council,
yeah.
Committee of Social Planning Councils. That was a fun experience for me. I had the opportunity to travel all over Ontario, and because we were a low-budget organization, I often stayed with people that I was meeting with and that sort of thing. I remember my first visit to Kirkland Lake. I stayed at the, I guess it's called a manse. The Catholic Church had a couple of pastors and a number of nuns who had their residence there. And it was a wonderful place to be, except they only spoke French. And I spoke no French at all. Not a word. Pas un mot. And in the morning, when I woke up, having slept in a bed with a crucifix over my head, which again was very foreign to me, one of the nuns who was up and at 'em and fixing breakfast and stuff, we tried very hard to make conversation. The only thing we could come to, the only thing we could find as the focus of our conversation was a thermometer on the wall, on the window. And we agreed that it said 0. And I could pronounce 0, and she could pronounce 0, and we had come to a meeting of the minds. So that was the kind of experience that I had in some of the social planning councils. At that time, if I remember correctly, that time or my next job, I'm not sure, Mike Harris was the Premier of Ontario. And for those who may not be familiar with Mike Harris, he was an extremely conservative politician who believed in that people deserved the situations in which they found themselves. If I remember correctly, he cut welfare rates substantially, cut social programs extensively, and it generally made life more difficult for those who were disadvantaged and for those who were trying to help them. So there was lots of fodder for social policy and social planning work to try and organize in each community to save the programs which were being threatened and to help the people who were experiencing more and more extreme poverty. I remember vividly, another thing that I remember is more of a personal nature, but the executive director of the Ontario Welfare Council at that time was a former military man, and he believed that things operated in as tight a framework as possible. Well, as you would have known, you've heard earlier parts of this interview, or as you would think, I don't deal well with tight frameworks. I am much more effective in whatever I'm doing if I have a little room. Well, at that time, I was living in Sarnia and working in downtown Toronto, and I was flying space available on the flight from Sarnia to Toronto. So I'd get to the Sarnia airport about 5:30 a.m., and hopefully there'd be a seat for me. Fly to Pearson Airport, run to the end of the subway line, get on the subway, take the subway to Bay and Bloor, which is where our office was, run up to the office and get to the office at 9:05 and be roundly criticized for being late. My experience at the Ontario Welfare Council was quite rewarding professionally, but difficult personally. What else? Made a lot of good connections there. Met many people who were doing fascinating work. The people at the Toronto Social Planning Council and the Hamilton Social Planning Council at that time were doing wonderful work on research, wonderful community organizing. OISE, at that time Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, also had some wonderful scholars who were doing work that informed the broader policy atmosphere. And I always thought that, continue to think that social policy is, public policy. I think that all public policy is social policy and all social policy is public policy, I think. That public policy can be much more likely to be productive depending on who you know. And I know that's not a democratic thing to say, but it is the case that, in my opinion, that if you can call somebody and say, hey Joe, I was talking to this guy and he told me about this, can you help me make a connection there? That things can happen much more effectively and much more rapidly with having a wide network of people. At the time I was working at the Canadian Council on Social Development, as I had mentioned, I was part of this group to repatriate the Canadian Constitution. And I was also part of a group, the Canadian Futures Society. Through those two organizations, I met some wonderful women who were dedicated to supporting women in whatever they were trying to accomplish. I shared with them my wonder, my awe about Kay Shimizu and Stuart Sutton, and my wish, my hope that I would be able to carry out an oral history project. Funding had not been coming forward on that project, and I was about to give up. A wonderful woman named Gail Stewart, she and her friend Kathy Stars were very active in the constitutional issues and the Canadian Future Society, as well as other community activities, said, we believe in what you're trying to do, and we want to encourage you. We have a little bit of money, and we would like to give it to you. It won't help you much in the project, but it might encourage you. And so they gave me $500 to put toward the project as it was developing and as it might come about. So I think it's really, it is so important and has always been important to me. The support that friends, family, colleagues, the informal acquaintances that can make such a difference in one's personal work and achievements. And that certainly was a great example of something that helped me on my way to carrying out the Oral History Project. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, the Oral History Project was developing, the money was available, the fellowship was available, and then I was had the opportunity. I needed to get the equipment. I had to buy equipment to carry across the country. I was going to be interviewing people primarily in their homes at their choice. That was something else the provincial associations arranged, was the time and location of the interviews within my travel schedule. So I had to buy a camera and an audio recorder. I got the best that CBC was using at the time, and the lightest video camera that was available at the time, which was, I don't know, probably 15 pounds. And I got to buy computers. This was in 1983, remember, and computers were sort of new then. And I didn't know what to buy, so I got the advice of, what's his name, Pierre? His name will occur to me in a moment. He was with the Canadian Association of Schools of Social Work, and he was a real techie fellow in the 1980s. So he and I shopped around, and I ended up buying not one, but 2 K-Pro computers. Because I was going to hire, I had money to hire someone to transcribe the interviews as they were completed. And the 2 K-Pro computers, they were billed as being portable. Well, they really were luggable because they weighed about 30 pounds each. I didn't take them on the road when I traveled. And they had an operating system called, what was it? It was, the software was WordStar, and it operated on a 5.5-inch floppy disk, which had, the computers that I bought had not only 20 megabytes of memory, but I splurged and got 40 megabytes of memory. And people asked me at the time, why would you ever want so much 40 megabytes of memory? I mean, really, that's pages and pages. So they thought I was being a bit extravagant in buying the 40 megabyte computers, but I didn't. I continue to be sort of a technical nerd, I guess. So the project started with some fits and starts on the personal level. There was a serious illness in my family that it turned out that I had to deal with, and that delayed my schedule somewhat. But starting in about January and going through, I don't know, June or July or October, something like that, of 1984, I guess it was, I interviewed the 50 pioneer social workers. All of them agreed to be videotaped, with, I think, one exception. The people had been sort of prepped by the Provincial Association of Social Work as to what the project was, how it was going to operate, and what the material would be used for upon conclusion of the interviews. For the most part, they were very, all of the interviewees were very enthusiastic about sharing their past. They ranged in the kind of work that they had done, from child welfare to welfare work. I don't remember who it was, but one of the interviewees who had worked in Toronto during the 30s, and she had worked at the welfare department there. And please keep in mind the social work education that she had had and that we have had now, and the principles and the values. The relief that was provided to the poor by the Toronto Welfare Department at the time was 5 sticks of pine wood, pine kindling, and a bag of beans, dry beans. Now, if you're a cook, you know, or if you're a camper, you know that pine burns quick, 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 quick. And you know that beans require long, long, long cooking. So although the interviewee said this to me, although the reality was there, I mean, they were giving relief, they were giving something, underneath it was a useless, in a sense, kind of activity. And to think of the ethical dilemmas that people in those days had to go through, I don't know whether they still experience them, probably they do, maybe not in quite such a blatant way, is something that has continued to move me around thinking about this project. There were people who, there was one particular volunteer who never went to the School of Social Work, although she helped found it. She was a socialite in Montreal, very wealthy family. Montreal at that time did not have a School of Social Work. But this woman thought that there should be one, and she and her well-to-do friends gathered around and pulled together money and got a School of Social Work started at Yale University. She talked about her dream of the School of Social Work as she sat on the ridge above, probably she was at Mount Royal, looking over the river and trying to figure out how she could, she probably didn't use these terms, how she could parlay money, wealth, connection, and social justice into a package that would result in a school of social work. So to me, it's important for me to remember that good social policy doesn't always happen with a professional background. It does sometimes, but sometimes these people who work outside can really have a huge impact on the profession as a whole. Others. Yeah, I remember another, a funny one, a woman that I interviewed in Newfoundland. She was an immigrant from Britain and had come to Canada in the 30s and was there during the war. She worked at the residential schools that were run by the Christian Brothers in St. John's. And I think of it now. I didn't know then. I don't think anybody publicly knew what was occurring behind closed doors at the orphanages and the residential schools. Nothing about it came out. Nothing at all. And perhaps that was my failure as an interviewee, or perhaps as an interviewer, or perhaps she just didn't know, or perhaps she decided not to talk about it. Any of which is fair, I think. But she was a funny woman. She lived in a great big double-wide trailer, and the end wall of the trailer was a huge parakeet cage, and there were dozens of parakeets in the cage, and I was trying to do the interview with the video camera and the audio recorder, the high-quality audio recorder, picking up every little sound, of course, and the birds kept chirping. So the lady, again, whose name I can't remember, I should have owned up on this, she went over and pulled up the sheet, looked under the sheet at the birds and said, "Now, you boys must stop talking. I have work to do here." And I got that on camera. And again, it was fun. It was fun. And I think, we are all people. We all have a breadth of personality that was shown by that lady. Another interviewee that I remember in particular was the man who started the School of Social Work at UBC. When I interviewed him, he was in his, I believe he was in his 90s at the time, and the UBC, I think, is perhaps the second oldest school of social work in the country. He talked again about what was different about when he talked about it was that there was a partnership between him and government to get a school of social work, because government, or the individuals in the government, realized that it would be important to the well-being of the people in British Columbia to have such a thing, and important to the country to have social workers, professional social workers, who could carry out government policies. Cyril Topping is his name, Cyril Topping. And we did a very short interview because of his age and his frailty, but he took the time and felt the responsibility that he later wrote to me with a substantial addition to the interview, because he knew that he hadn't said everything he wanted to say. An example of people's dedication to the profession, I think. Just a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful fellow. Pioneers, these people were all pioneers, of course. I remember the interview of Father Byrne, B-Y-R-N-E, in Alberta. And as a Catholic priest, he had, and a social worker, he felt he had a responsibility to mobilize the community around whatever issues were going on in Calgary in the day. And again, this would have been in the 40s, I think, the 40s and 50s. And he talked about a movement that he helped found called the Dandelion. And the image has stayed with me. He said the dandelion it's bright and colorful and draws lots of attention. and it, as it ages, it turns and its seeds spread. And you think that it's gone away and it won't bother you anymore. But remember that the dandelion has very deep roots and it'll be back. So his description of social movements really resonated with me. He had thought it through and was able to pull people together around that image. Another woman, another person in Alberta who worked in the child welfare system, and in the 30s and 40s, children were adopted. They were sent from England, which was experiencing tremendous poverty and tremendous difficulty because of the war, the Second World War. The children were sent to Canada and were farmed out to various households around the province. In this case, it was Alberta. The young people were, in some cases, probably not all, used pretty much as slaves. They weren't even hired hands because they got no money. If they were lucky, they were fed and clothed to a certain extent, often mistreated. The child welfare authorities were aware of that, and through the leadership of this particular social worker, he led a parade of cars out through the countryside of Alberta, collecting some of these young people and bringing them back into I think it was Calgary, so that better places could be found for them to live, so that they would no longer be abused. The image of a parade of people rescuing these abandoned, or they weren't abandoned, they were abused young people is an image that sticks with me. As I think of it now, I don't remember that there was a lot of discussion about Aboriginal people. And I don't know why that was. I don't know. It probably speaks to the, again, the public policy stance that Indian peoples were dealt with by the federal government to the extent that they were assisted at all, and were not within the purview of provincial or municipal officials and social workers, although I don't know that that's the case. Tara, I'm sort of running out of things on oral history. Can you help me?
Well, I think one of the things that I noticed, and I have not reviewed all 54 tapes, but I've reviewed 15 of them, is that there seems to be a theme of people, like there's a mobility that came with social work. So a lot of people, like as I was sort of categorizing people provincially, you know, you had them organized based on the province that they were nominated by and the province you interviewed them in. But if you look even at someone like Kay, she was from British Columbia, practiced in British Columbia, and then moved to Ontario, but still has some connections in BC in terms of the work that she did around, like later work, around the apology to Japanese Canadians by the federal government. So yes, she's from Ontario, but she's also from BC. So there seemed to be a lot of mobility. If you look at someone like Florence Philpott, she was from Hamilton, did her training partly in the States and partly in Toronto. She worked in Ontario, many places in Ontario. Then she moved, I think, to Manitoba. Then she moved somewhere else on the west side of the country, and then back to Ontario. So there seems to be this, this kind of mobility. Do you have any thoughts about that? I realize this is kind of an off-the-cuff question, but I just thought it was kind of a theme that people become knowledgeable or pioneering spirits in their own province, and then they have an opportunity to bring that knowledge to other places.
Yeah, there is, at least there was, there has been mobility. I think depending on what the individual wants to do in their profession. And of course, like all of us, there are people who like to do, they want to go into work at 9 o'clock and they want to do what's set out for them to do, and they want to go home at 5 o'clock and they want to think about something else and do something else. Absolutely essential. You can't operate a social welfare system without that, that dedication to the daily task. At the same time, there are people who form their connections locally, provincially, nationally, and maybe they develop an expertise in a particular area, let's say housing or income security or unemployment, or employment, depending on which decade you're speaking of, and find that the scope is somewhat limited. And again, I don't mean to sound cynical, but I have seen that there are only a certain number of times that you can meet with government and say poverty has to be dealt with. The income security system has to be improved. To meet with the same people saying the same thing, using essentially the same research, because the research, the facts of the matter, in my view, haven't changed that much in 40 years. The root causes of poverty, homelessness, and unemployment, in my view, are the same as they were then, with some nuances, of course, and some new developments, like technology. So it makes sense to me that people would want to go to another place and have another opportunity to maybe make a little more progress on their front, housing, for example, to organize or be part of a different group of professionals and colleagues and community organizations. So it makes sense to me that people would move for their own personal reasons. Family reasons, of course, family reasons are why people stay and don't move. I think that that covers my thoughts on mobility.
And I guess the other question I have is, when you're hearing these stories, because Canada has kind of a fragmented policy infrastructure with the we have federal organization of for the funding of services, then we have provincial systems for administering the services, and many of the services are then contracted out to municipal level or local level service providers. So one of the things that I thought was interesting, and I'm wondering if you maybe have any other insights into this, was when I was reviewing Mary Henry's, Sister Mary Henry's tape. I mean, her story was very interesting because she practiced between 1928 and probably was still practicing when you interviewed her in the 80s, although she was quite an elderly woman, I think born in about 1908. And so she had, started her profession working really in children's services in what would have been known as the orphanage at that time and place. And she was talking about how new social problems presented themselves, but that the province had no responses to those new social problems. So she was talking about post-World War II, the level of alcoholism, that substance use that people were experiencing was very significant. And that prior to that time, prior to the folks going to war, it had not been to the same level. And so there was no infrastructure. There was one detox in the entire province, and you couldn't attend the detox if you were actually still actively using, which makes no sense, but so they were doing all of this stuff to try and give people the capacity to access detox by developing other services. So that's one example. She was talking about the fact that during the Depression there was no maternal care, so there were no midwives available to support women who lived in rural communities to deliver their babies, and people were so poor they often had no linens, for example. to have at the birth.
Mm-hmm.
So she was really talking about this constant process of advocacy, and that Catholics in the province of Prince Edward Island did not have voting rights, which I did not know. So I guess, did you come across any of those other sort of stories, and perhaps not, this is an off the cuff kind of question, where the uniqueness of the social policy context at the provincial level really presented itself in the stories that people were telling? I mean, I have to do more research about PEI, and what's interesting is PEI has no school of social work, so folks go to Dalhousie or MUN.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that there's anyone who's done a social policy history of PEI specifically, and there's no one I can find at UPEI who specializes in policy history. So it may be just that that province has a unique context with no social work program of their own.
If you wanted to look into that further, you could look up a fellow named John Eldon Green, and I know that he was a real advocate. He was in the provincial government, and a really strong advocate for progressive policy. An advocate to such an extent that he was, if I remember correctly, shunned and excommunicated from the policy community of the day. But he knew, and if he's still around, knows PEI inside out. Very powerful person. As far as provincial policies, I'm sorry, I just don't remember. My impression is that in the day, the 40s and the 50s, and then into the 60s, the policies were largely federal, because the Canada Assistance Plan was the main funder of social programs across the country for decades, until the review of the Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act in the 1980s. And municipal policy was governed by whatever the politicians thought should happen. I don't remember that the provinces had a huge role. The cost sharing through federal provincial fiscal arrangements was primarily around healthcare, not exclusively, but primarily. So I don't remember the provinces having. See, even in Ontario, I think welfare rates were set by municipalities, although I'm not sure about that. The provincial organizations, provincial governments in other provinces would have set the welfare rates, though, because the cities didn't have the capacity to do it. I'm sorry, my memory is foggy on that.
It's fine, and it was kind of an obscure question, and really more just my own, I think, shock at the policy landscape that Mary Henry was talking about within the province of Prince Edward Island. So, yeah. It was an indulgence.
But it's still an interesting thing to study, because it's so small.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you do progressive social policy in a province that has so few people and such a small tax base?
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that? Good question.
Yeah, very much so. So these interviews, you did the interviews, you traveled around, you must have had a vision or a hope or a dream or desire about what would happen with all of this information. So these 50 or maybe even 54 interviews. What was your vision for what would happen with all of this material when your part in it was done?
Yeah, I had no expectation nor wish to carry it further. My job, as I saw it, was to collect the information and to make sure that it was, to do what I could, to make sure that it was accessible to those who would carry it on. So I hired 2 people to do the transcripts, to transcribe the audio tapes into print format, not digital. This was pre-digital. This was pre-internet, not into digital format. And to negotiate with the Public Archives of Canada how they would deal with the material. They did indeed want it. It was seen as a project that would be beneficial to Canada. I think it was the Sound Archives that I dealt with. They agreed that they would house the one copy of the audio tapes, the videotapes, and 2 copies of the written transcripts. They, to my recollection, did not want the floppy disks that the transcriptions rested on. So once those negotiations were complete, I was pleased to be able to obtain hard copies, bound hard copies of the interviews, to my recollection, they were also provided to the Canadian Association of Social Work, Schools of Social Work. I am many things, and one of my achievements is that I can keep most of them integrated most of the time. What that means is that my life as a social work professional is closely related to the work that I do as a volunteer. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to do a number of volunteer activities, which I found very rewarding, and which I think have enriched my my understanding of the profession. Starting at the earliest one was when I was at the School of Social Work at the University of Washington. I lived in married student housing, although I was a single parent. And the child care center in that married student housing complex was for faculty only. Only the children of faculty could go there, and our kids could not. I took on as a field placement there, with lots of consultation from the professors at the School of Social Work, how to get that changed. And working with the professors through the field placement, I was able to lead a transition of that child care facility to become one that students could have access to, as well as, and then eventually instead of the faculty. And also was helpful in getting that housing renovated. It had been built as post-World War II housing in the 1945 to 1950. And some of the showers had been in existence for that long. There were holes in the floors, and the conditions in some were pretty bad. That was a new experience for me. I'd never had the experience of being able to participate in change in a positive social setting. My earlier experiences of change were somewhat different, with some not very constructive ways of dealing with things I didn't like. Later on, while I was working as a professional at the Canadian Council on Social Development, I think it was, I had the opportunity to, excuse me, I have to remember which one I'm talking about. Yeah, it was when I was at the Canadian Council on Social Development. One of the ongoing problems in the city of Ottawa, where I lived then and now, was poverty and unemployment. And a church that I belonged to was and continues to be very dedicated to trying to make things better through both advocacy and through social programs. So friends and I were sitting around one day and thought, gee, I wonder if there's something we could do. Well, a tiny bit of money, a couple $1,000s, became available from the local church association. It's called the Presbytery. And they were looking for an innovative project to deal with poverty. And my friend Andre Fontaine, still a very active social worker, he works in foster care now, does foster care for gay kids and with gay parents. He and I came up with the idea of a laundry cooperative because he had a lot of connections with people on the street. I had a fair number of connections with people who were very low income and homeless. We talked to them about whether or not how did they do their laundry? It was just one of those random questions, you know. And they said, well, usually we don't. The laundromats cost at least $2 to wash and at least $1 to dry. We don't do laundry. It's very unusual that we would be able to do that. Well, if you had a place to go where it was affordable, would that help? I said, yeah, because then I'd have clean clothes to wear to a job interview. Yeah, that would really help. And so, through my church and another church and Andre's organization, which was the Centertown Community Health Center, we developed a proposal for a laundry cooperative that would be run by and for low-income people. We were able to raise substantial amounts of money, several $100,000, all from private sources. No government sources were, nor were United Way sources involved. It was fascinating. It's a whole different world. It was a whole different world then, and would be now if it happened to us today. There was an organization of Catholic nuns who were in a position where they wanted to devolve some of their assets because they were getting old and weren't able to use the money effectively themselves anymore. And they wanted to donate the money to a cause that they felt would be in the public interest. So we talked with them. We had a couple of conversations over a cup of coffee, where so many good things happen. And we said, if we could have $75,000, that would be our goal. That's what we're looking for among various sources. And they said, well, fine. And I said, well, I'll write up a proposal and and tell you the exact and how we're going to use it. And they said, no. We know what you have in mind. We believe in you. We trust in you. The money belongs to the organization to do what it would do. And I said, well, I'll send you annual reports. They said, no, it's okay. We believe in you. That kind of trust and generosity is something that it can be fostered, it can be found, and it is truly a wonderful thing. So we started the laundry co-op, and can I tell some stories?
Oh, please.
To the knowledge of the people involved, there was nothing like it in North America, so we were kind of carving new ground. We got money for 2 washers and 2 dryers, I think, and charged 50 cents to wash and, I don't know, 50 cents to dry, and a 50-cent a year membership. So we wanted people to have some recognition that this wasn't completely a handout kind of activity. People would come in and they would wash their clothes and they'd dry their clothes, and we had a setting that was comfortable. There was the ever-present coffee pot, a sofa, and some comfortable chairs. And people would come in, and of course they had to wait for their laundry to be done. Well, we organized through a number of our various community connections that professionals would come in and just be available. So we had a psychiatrist who'd come in and just sit, and if somebody wanted to talk about their medication, there he was. No formal interviews, no formal prescribing, just, oh, you're having that problem with your meds. Well, here's, we had child care specialists who would come in and talk, just be available to chat. We had housing specialists who would come in and be available. They'd give workshops. If there was enough interest, they'd do a workshop. We always called it lurking with intent. The churches were very involved in the organization, but not in a way to proselytize. There was no pushing of any religion, of any religious point of view. The idea that everybody, the thing that was unique about the organization, I think, is that we on the board, and we worked with the membership, is that we were all in this together. That if it wasn't me who was on the street today, it could be. If it wasn't them who was in the middle of, if it wasn't another board member who was in the middle of some horrible family crisis, it could be. And that we had a mutual responsibility and respect for each other to do what, to help in this way that we could. We decided that the project should be a community economic development project because we wanted the people to be able to earn a little bit of money. So we trained those who wanted to do laundry for others, if they wished. And we were operating in the Bronson Center at the time, which was a big community center with about 30 social organizations in it. The first contract that was carried out was, there was a woman in the building who had some baby clothes that she wanted to donate to a women's educational center here in town called the USWLC Center. They was a high school for single moms, along with a child care center. So this woman wanted to donate baby clothes, and so we had two guys who decided they would be our first laundry professionals. The one fellow, great big guy, who had a limitation, probably from cerebral palsy or something, that he couldn't have the use of his right arm. So he recruited his friend, little fellow, small fellow, but he had the use of both arms. And they washed the clothes and they folded them. And they felt so proud. They earned some money. And they earned, you know, not a lot, $15, $20 maybe for doing these 3 or 4 loads of baby clothes. They earned some money, and the tall fellow, he was telling us about this at a community meeting, about how proud he was to have done this work. And he said, with the money I earned, I bought 2 watches. I bought this one, and I bought a candy bar for my girlfriend, and I bought a new pair of pants. And he said, 2 watches? I don't need 2 watches. I'll give this one to you, Armand. Armand was on his way to a mission in Guatemala and didn't have a watch. So he found, out of the little bit of money that he was willing to share. The other part of the story is that when the laundry was done, Guy, I think was his name, Guy and Armand took the baby clothes to the USWLC Center. And they arrived at lunchtime when the young moms were just getting out of their classes. And all the young moms were going around looking at these clothes and going, oh, look at this, it's going to be so cute for Johnny, oh, just the right thing for Sally. And Guy started to cry. He said, I can see that I've made a difference. So through a different kind of social work, I think, a little bit different maybe, people were helped. We had some stories about trying to convince people to get on board with the idea. One of the fellows was a doctor in a community center, and he didn't think a laundry would make any difference in the lives of people. That he didn't get it. He wasn't ornery or anything. He just didn't get it until one of his clients came in, and he asked his client, his patient, just out of curiosity, how do you do your laundry? And he said, well, I have 1 pair of jeans, and I live in a room that has a hand sink. So if the weather's good and it's going to be warm, I do my best to wash my jeans in the hand sink, and then I hang them up and hope that they'll dry in time for my job interview. The doctor got it and became one of our most avid supporters. So that was a project, and the laundry co-op still operates. That was in 1997, and it still operates, which I'm happy about. Still doing the same thing.
And do you know, Karen, how how the monetary piece of the laundry works now? Do they have funding, or are they still relying on the community for support?
No, they did get United Way funding for a number of years, and with changes in the United Way, and I think the United Way went to sort of a single focus kind of approach, and so the agencies that were sort of on the margins lost their funding. So they get funding from individuals now, but I don't know how they fund it. As is often my way, I finish a project and move on.
Absolutely, absolutely. I just, it must have been like very rewarding. One of the things about funding is it's like having somebody's hand in your pocket. So you can't really walk your own way because you always have this person with their hand in your pocket. So it must have been very rewarding to work on a project where the hand in your pocket didn't want reports, or, that the hand in your pocket wasn't in your pocket.
No, they were supportive, and some of the sisters came in as volunteers. Again, just not preaching, not proselytizing, but befriending. And what better support can you have, really? It was really... Then, the next project that I think that I was involved in was the development of a funeral cooperative in Ottawa. This is an idea that there is a funeral cooperative in Sudbury. It's the only other one in Ontario. The idea, they are true cooperatives owned by the members, operated on democratic and cooperative principles. The slogan that we often used, on the board often used, is low cost, no pressure. The funeral industry is very challenging to deal with, very much commercial enterprise, and the pressure that is often put on those who are bereaved is nearly unbelievable. So again, I was pleased to, and my role on the board there was to help them develop a value statement, because as a new organization, and one which was going to be dealing with money, any organization, I guess, including the social organizations that I was part of, sometimes money calls the tune. And to what extent were we going to do certain kinds of advertising? To what extent who were we going to charge? Were the charges going to be equal to everybody? What were we going to charge for? Why not? How are we going to present ourselves to the public as an organization? So I was really pleased to have the opportunity to develop the value statement, the mission statement, value statement, and statement of principles for that organization, and continued to work on it for a couple of years. I developed cancer and was out of volunteering for 3 or 4 years, I guess. All is well, and I'm fully recovered. Taken on my latest volunteer project, which, and it's not the last, I don't think. I've been really lucky in my volunteer work to be able to find projects that I love to do, which let me do what I'm good at. I don't serve on boards of directors anymore because they're not my thing. And now I'm more likely to be involved with individuals and organizations. The most recent and current activity is I'm the volunteer business manager of a catering service. The service is provided by Syrian refugee women, and we cater to all kinds of events. This is not an ad, although I'll give you my business card if you want. I can't resist. Some of me is a salesperson. We cater events from dinners for 8 to conferences for 150. And so the way that started is that one of the Syrian refugee women, Ida, she is such a star as an individual. She is from Damascus, has lots of great experience in business in Syria and Lebanon, but wanted to help Syrian refugee women here, many of whom were from rural Syria, who had no work experience at all, many of whom were not literate in Arabic, much less in English, and who don't speak English at all, and who are becoming quite isolated in their new home in Ottawa. She was trying to think of a way that they could earn a little money, do something that mattered to them and to the community, and share Syrian culture. So she and I came up with the idea of a catering service, and we've been doing it ever since, for a year now. She's the food manager, and she is paid. I'm the volunteer business manager, and I deal with all the administrative stuff, and I love it.
Excellent.
So that's where my social work career has taken me. So far.
So far.
So far.
Excellent. So sort of reflecting on the experiences that you've had over your long career, do you have any thoughts about the context of contemporary social work, the context of professionalization? I mean, we've talked about social work as a profession, and there was a time when social work as a profession was the understanding that there were a bunch of people doing a kind of work where we had a shared value system, we had a shared maybe educational background, but not always. We had a shared set of ethical principles that we worked from. Now professionalization means you belong to the College of Social Workers, you're a registered social worker, you have a professional identity, and there's less, I mean, many of the people that you interviewed started out with some other kind of career background and then eventually decided that they would go back and do some kind of training in social work, but some of them not. So this idea that social work at one time was the work that you did, and now it's the credentials that you hold and the membership that you hold, is certainly a shift. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
I'm sorry to say it's not something that I've paid a lot of attention to lately. I did take the opportunity of coming to this interview and reading through your questions to talk with my daughter about it. My daughter is 50 and she's connected through her work circles, which are business circles. She's not connected with the social organizations at all. She has a view of social workers as being those people who hand out money at the welfare office. Now, my impression these days is that's not the case. That you would rarely find a professional social worker in that kind of work. That they would be more likely to be doing administration perhaps, or education perhaps, or in leadership positions of organizations. So it seems to me, now maybe I'm wrong, that relationships with individuals has also changed. That the work is less work with individuals and more so with organizations and policies. But I don't know if that's the case.
I think we had spoken earlier yesterday about you wanting to say something about the separation of the professional and the personal. That you had some thoughts about that for social workers. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, it's interesting because it really relates to the previous question, doesn't it? I have not been as close to the profession as I was some decades ago. My impression in the early days was that to be a professional was the credentials you held, and that your work took place under the rubric of those professional credentials, and that what you did in your personal life, or who you were in your personal life, was verboten. It was not to intervene at all, to insinuate itself into your professional work. That never made sense to me. As I was saying earlier, I am who I am. I am many things. And all of those things, they make me all of who I am. I'm not just, and I'm not knocking it, I'm not just a professional social worker, nor am I just a volunteer, nor am I just a great-grandmother. I'm all of those things and many others together. It seemed to me that over the decades that there became a recognition of the importance of the personal to professional practice, recognizing perhaps that or even saying that if you hadn't had the experience, for example, of being an abused woman, you really couldn't do good practice. You really had to understand it, maybe even from a personal level. You couldn't be totally, that it would be very difficult to take out all of the personal experience as you were doing your professional practice. So it seemed to me that there was some coming together of those two spheres. As you're saying now, there is apparently quite a separation again. I'm just not aware of that. If that is the case, I think my personal opinion would be that that is unfortunate. Life is very challenging, the world is very challenging, and to have to keep yourself separated from, to have yourself defined in such a limited way, I think would be a real disadvantage. For me, social work provided a framework within which I could become all that I am. It gave legitimacy to my questioning, to my what if, to my why not. And it was very important as a framework. Later on, other frameworks, particularly those of 12-step programs, became important to me. But they always gave me room. I've tried not to treat frameworks as cages, but to push at the boundaries, to try to make way, either for myself or others, to be more fully the humans that, in my view, we are created to be. So anything that hinders or dismisses that integration as being important, I think is a limitation of point of view.
I don't have any other questions for you, believe it or not. Is there anything else you'd like to say? Any advice you'd like to give in closing?
Not advice so much as an observation, is that I find that I've learned most over my life, including my professional career, by listening and by asking questions. Don't stop listening and don't stop asking questions. Okay, that's all.
Thank you.